Alright, so this is how I realized that all drugs must be illegal and that there truly is no other solution for this immensely terrible drug crisis that we've got going on in this country and throughout the world, really. But to start off with the story, I would like to ask everybody watching this video to continue with an open mind and to think objectively of everything I'm about to say. Because in the whole argument of drug legalization, decriminalization, prohibition, whatever you believe in, we all have the same goal, right? We all want less people to be addicted to these drugs. We want less lives to be ruined, and we want everybody to be safer, healthier, and we want more people to live. And, all those people that are addicted, they deserve our love and compassion. But going on, I would like to ask everybody to keep an open mind because there's really a lot to get into on this topic. But anyway, to start from here, it all started when I was 15, about a month from when I turned 16. That's when I first smoked weed with one of my buddies, and I liked it, and I do still like it to this day. I enjoy smoking weed, and about 2 months later, I had ended up trying LSD. I got it through a dealer, the guy that was selling weed, and I had done my research. When I saw that he was selling LSD, I was kind of curious. I was like, "What's this? I've heard about it, but I don't really know anything about it." And I did some research. I learned that LSD has no addictive properties. Huh, that's interesting. And LSD, it's not going to kill me. Huh, that's interesting. So I ended up trying it out and had an immensely amazing time. It was quite enjoyable, and I purchased 2 tabs, had 2 separate experiences, and both times were quite amazing and nothing bad happened. And that was kind of the beginning of when I realized that I had been lied to my whole life about what these drugs caused and how these drugs affected people. It was the beginning of my realization that what I had previously perceived as what drug use was not at all what I had been told it is. After I tried LSD, I began experimenting with other drugs like psilocybin, MDMA. I even tried salvia at one point, DMT, and I tried drugs that weren't psychedelics or hallucinogens as well. Like I've tried Xanax, dextroamphetamine, oxycodone, bupropion, and a bunch of other drugs that I've used recreationally that I can't say I'm particularly proud of for using them, and I've certainly used a few of them a bit more than I should have. But at the time, I was kind of curious. I wanted to understand the perspective of the people that use these drugs because I wanted to understand addiction more, and I wanted to really just understand what these drugs were and how they affected people. But sometimes I also just wanted to have a good time, and that's something I've realized now is there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to have a good time, if you want to take some Xanax and have a good time, if you can control yourself and be okay, like 90% of people can, the vast majority, then there's nothing wrong with that. You don't need to be ashamed of drug use, and that's one of the things that I've learned from my experiences is that there's really nothing to be ashamed of. Even though I have definitely used Xanax in particular a bit more than I should have in the past. I haven't used it in quite a while now because of that. Uh, there's still nothing to be ashamed of because there's nothing to be ashamed of. It's my body, it's my life, and it's my choice. So yeah, that's kind of one of the big things I've learned is that there's no reason for people to be guilty or ashamed for using drugs like people usually are. A lot of the people that use drugs, even psychedelics that are not harmful for you at all in terms of physically, they can be a bit scary, they can be a bit challenging and difficult to go through the experience itself at times, but usually that's when you learn the most from the drug itself. But anyway, to get through my rambling, my point is you don't need to be ashamed, there's no reason to be guilty. And as I experimented more with drugs, I realized that the fact that we're stopping people from using these drugs and we're not allowing them to have access to these drugs that are safe, regulated, and pure, and synthesized and manufactured under conditions of which they can be safe, and people will know what dosage they're taking, they'll know what they're taking and exactly how much because they are perfectly measured as to how much of the drug that they are consuming, right? And so I realized that by withholding access to these drugs, you're actually hurting more people because if you look at a chart of the overdose rates in comparison to the opioid prescription rates. So the amount of people that were prescribed opiates just 10 years ago, and then the amount of people that were overdosing on opiates. As the prescriptions went down, overdoses went up. It was directly inverse because as people lose a safe, regulated drug that they know exactly what it is and they know what it contains and that it's completely pure and they know how much they're consuming, when they lose that knowledge and they lose that security, overdoses go up, and it's about 5-6 times as many people die simply by the fact that these drugs are illegal. Now, when you take that one statistic right there, already the downsides of prohibiting substances greatly outweigh the, the minor increase in usage that will inevitably come with legalization. That's one of the main arguments that people have against legalization. What's stopping everybody from becoming addicted if these drugs are freely accessible to anybody, right? Well, that's a good point, but look at alcohol. It's worse for your body than heroin, believe it or not. In terms of addictiveness, heroin and opiates and many other drugs, they're definitely higher up on that scale, but alcohol is on par with many other addictive drugs. And then you look at nicotine as well, it's way worse than many illegal drugs that we have, or on par with them. And so when you realize that we've got drugs that are legal that are just as bad, if not worse, than many of the illegal drugs now, and then you also have to take into account that the fact that these illegal drugs are not regulated, they're extremely unsafe, and the people that are using those drugs don't know what they're truly consuming or how much. You got to realize you're not comparing apples to apples entirely, and still alcohol makes heroin look pretty good in terms of the way that the drug affects people. So in that regard, pretty much every argument against legalizing drugs can be counteracted with alcohol as an example, because it's such a damaging drug and it's so terrible for you, but for some reason it gets this one pass in our culture, and it's just completely socially accepted, probably due to the fact that you drink it rather than smoking it or inhaling it or ingesting it. But it really doesn't make sense that if heroin's going to be illegal, if morphine or any other opiate or even fentanyl, if all those drugs are going to be illegal, why is alcohol legal? It doesn't make any sense. And we can see with prohibition that keeping these drugs prohibited, it only decreases usage by about 20 to 30%, but over time it actually does nothing. Over time, the usage of the drug actually goes back to the pre-prohibition levels, and so it really doesn't do anything. It accomplishes nothing except consuming an immense amount of resources and finance and money in order to pay for law enforcement, the judicial system, the hospitals, due to the increased amount of overdoses and accidents that occur from people using these drugs and not having correct information, being poorly educated on how to safely and responsibly use drugs, and a number of other contributing factors that cause people to either get hurt or for people to make mistakes, or just random little things that increase costs over time. And like the fact that the drugs themselves are immensely more expensive, which makes it quite difficult for those that are addicted to these drugs, which they tend to be impoverished, poor, and of lower education status. It makes them far harder for those people to be able to afford the necessities that they need in order to thrive and to be in a state and a financial status where they can overcome their addiction. Because after all, the greatest contributor to addiction is mental illness, physical and mental conditions. So not just mental illness, but physical and mental conditions. And then it's also impoverishment and then low education. Those are the three greatest correlations to addiction. So when you take that into account, addiction is it's less of a problem of access, but more of a problem of people not having their basic needs met. And so when you realize that, it doesn't make sense for us to be banning these drugs, especially when you take into account that the vast majority of people that use these drugs do not become addicted either. So once you add all of those things together and you kind of put them together and you weigh out the pros and cons of prohibition and legalization, you can really see why just prohibition, it's all downsides, and legalization, it gives you a bunch of ways to sort of ease the pain that is perpetuated with prohibition. For example, think about all of the revenue that can be generated from these legal drugs that would be purchased by those that are addicts and recreational responsible users. Think about it's something like an estimated 150 $200 billion is spent a year just within the United States on illegal drugs. So imagine if we had, add an extra 10 to 20% of that for or take 10 to 20% of that and take that as taxes. Imagine if we had that much money in taxes to go towards treatment, but also just that much extra money going into the economy for funding these businesses, mental health treatment centers, and all of these other, health centers that can contribute towards fighting off addiction and making sure that everybody's healthy, happy, and cared for. So now that I've laid out those kind of main points, those are the realizations that have come to me over the last couple years on this drug legalization topic. At first, it was kind of difficult to deal with, and it seems a bit counterintuitive, because you're essentially saying, in order to reduce addiction and to solve all these problems that we're having today, we need to make the drugs more accessible. That's kind of what it sounds like to most people at first, but at the end of the day, you're not just making these drugs more accessible. You're reducing the amount of people that die from them. You're giving more ability for people to be safe and responsible and to not die from them. And you're allowing people to have the resources that they need to seek treatment through the revenue that's generated from selling these drugs legally. So that's really all there is to it. It's pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of different individual ways in which this prohibition contributes towards the perpetuation of addiction. Because after all, one of the great correlations, besides those other contributing factors I mentioned earlier, is that addiction tends to occur in people whose lives are chaotic, filled with pain, and they're just going through a struggle and a mess of a time in their life. And that's kind of how I was with Xanax for a short period of time, when I wasn't addicted, but I misused Xanax for certain, and I was definitely using it more regularly than I should have, because I was going through such a chaotic time of my life. I was so depressed and anxious and stressed all the time, and I usually my coping mechanism is intense exercise, but I had gotten to a point where exercise could not fix the pain, and I had nothing else that I could turn towards except using anti-anxiety medication to physically ease that pain, that the perpetuating anxiety that was in my chest all day, every day. It was so terrible. And that's when you have people go to prison for doing something that doesn't even impact anybody else. Drug use doesn't impact anybody else. It shouldn't even be illegal just by the fact that whose rights are impeded by me using a drug or someone else using a drug? Nobody. It may be bad for me, but it might be the best thing for me as well in the case of psychedelics and their therapeutic potential. And so the government shouldn't be allowed to dictate what medicines each individual is allowed to consume, because at the end of the day, there's just so many medicines, and the government can't simply be educated or wise enough to determine what is best for the individual. There's too many people in this world, and yeah, out of all the arguments there is for drug legalization, that's the only opinionated one, the opinion that we should all have the right to consume whatever substance it is that we desire, as long as it does not interfere with the rights of others. But besides that, I'm going to start wrapping up this video, because those are kind of the main points I wanted to get across. If this drug epidemic we're going through, it's crazy, and it's so dumbfounding to me, because we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. We could fix this entirely. Well, we're not going to fix addiction entirely. There's always going to be a certain amount of people that are addicted, but we could ease so much of the pain, the struggle, the perpetuating cycle of addiction that we're causing on ourselves. All of these people that go to prison for something that interferes with nobody's rights, and the pain, the chaos, the mental illness, it's just perpetuating the addiction. It's not right. It's terrible. And if we want to make everybody's lives better, we truly need to legalize these drugs. Thank you, and have a great day.